Hello, I'm Ed,
And I'm Ben.
and this is What About Porridge? Welcome back. It's What About Porridge? It's the podcast where we dig into health, nutrition, and all the fascinating stuff that goes on behind the scenes in our bodies. I'm here once again to ask the questions, and with me is Ben, a nutritional therapist with more knowledge than we know what to do with. And we can also show off that we're now on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify and a bunch of other places as well. So find us wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. Also, if you're curious about any of the details from this episode and indeed our previous episodes, you can take a look at our new website, whataboutporridge.com, and find our contact details and also kind of various documents that we refer to throughout the episode.
Yeah, we've had some really good feedback, and so please keep it coming. We love hearing from you. But we're not going to let the fact that we're now number 114 on Apple Podcasts go to our head. And so please remember...
It's tough.
So please remember that nothing in this podcast should be considered medical advice.
Indeed. And in today's episode, the topic is going to be about what should you eat? And after that, I believe you've got another real-life case study from your clinic for us to discuss.
Yep, we're going to be talking about Jemima, a 37-year-old female with gut problems that include pain and flatulence, and symptoms that include low energy and mood problems.
Perfect. I will look forward to that. All right, let's crack on. So everyone grab your magnesium-rich snack of choice, sit back, and let's get started.
Perfect. So in episode 1, we began with why we eat, and we made it clear that we eat to provide our bodies with all the nutrients they need to support life. And then in episode 2, we had to address the name of our podcast. And so we did an analysis of porridge, and I didn't have great things to say about it. But we analysed porridge in the context of someone eating a typical Western diet, and we showed that diet doesn't anywhere near provide the nutrients that our cells, tissues, and organs need for basic day-to-day function. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about what you actually should eat in order to give your body the nutrients it needs.
All right. So, okay, this is good. I think, though, we're going to need to stay somewhat grounded in reality, right? So I'm not going to be letting you get away with an entire diet just made up of organ meats, herbs and spices, and dark chocolate.
I think that's reasonable, yeah. I totally get that not everyone is eating Tesco sandwiches, and I also get that very few people have the time to grow broccoli sprouts on their windowsills and soak their liver. So I'll try and keep it real.
Perfect.
But let's do a quick recap for anyone that missed episode 2, which was called Should You Eat Porridge? And in that episode, we did an analysis which included eating porridge for breakfast, a salad for lunch, and lasagna for dinner. And we included 3 very typical snacks, but the results showed that apart from carbohydrate and sodium, those meals didn't provide enough nutrition to meet a single macro or micronutrient target. But then after the episode, Ed challenged me, and he pointed out that despite containing 122% of the target for carbohydrates, the overall number of calories was actually quite low.
Yeah, it didn't seem like a lot of food overall. I also should say I had some strong feedback from some porridge superfan listeners who didn't feel that really sandwiches and ready meal lasagnas were typical of the diet of the porridge eater.
Yeah, we're going to respond to that. So today we're going to share a different diet analysis, which is much more based around what you should eat and won't be featuring any sandwiches. But just for fun, I did decide to revisit the analysis from episode 2, and I doubled the lunch and the dinner to 2 sandwiches and 2 lasagnas. And it's
You're doubling down.
It still only met the nutritional targets for carbohydrate and sodium. So it's pretty amazing. You'd be getting 165% of your daily carbohydrates, but only 53% of the fats you need and 68% of the protein you need. and the vitamins and minerals were miles away from meeting the minimum targets. And that's an important thing to remember. These are minimum targets that are designed to prevent the onset of deficiency diseases. So, in other words, to prevent malnutrition. And so all this begs the question, what should you eat in order to meet your nutrient needs? And in this episode, we're going to answer that question.
Okay, so just before we get into that, just when you say they're minimum targets, so actually, if anyone is doing as we've suggested and tracking some of their food in Chronometer, they shouldn't necessarily be worried about going over the micronutrient targets in most cases.
In most cases, as long as they're not supplementing on top of that. And yeah, by and large, we can be comfortable with that. In fact, you'll see that the analysis that we provide today does exceed most of the targets. But if you're getting your nutrients from whole foods and you're not eating some sort of crazy diet where you're doing a lot of protein powders or anything like that, I think you're pretty safe.
Brilliant.
So we have this foundational understanding from our first couple of podcasts that to be healthy, you absolutely must meet or exceed your nutritional targets. And you have to do that consistently, day in and day out.
Okay, so when you say day in, day out, and I guess we'll get to this in a bit, but do you mean that you need to be meeting every micronutrient need every day, or does it kind of average out over a longer period?
That's a very good question. So the body has some capacity to store and regulate certain nutrients. So some amount of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, and some minerals like iron and zinc can be stored and then can be used as needed. But water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C and the B vitamins need to be consumed a lot more regularly. And that's because they're lost every day in the urine and through sweat and so on. So I would say that for optimum health, you should set the bar high and meet your targets on most days. But, slight fluctuations here and there are fine.
Nice.
So where do you start if you want to find the optimum diet? Well, one thing is for sure is that you shouldn't start with our national dietary guidelines. And that's because they've been shown to be nutritionally deficient. So here in the UK, we have the so-called Eat Well guide.
Which I know you're a huge fan of. Just before,
I always put it in air quotes, which doesn't translate well in a podcast. But
then Eat Well Guide Mountfield.
So when it was launched, a PhD nutrition researcher I follow called Dr. Zoe Harcum analysed the meals that accompanied the Eat Well guide and found that if you followed them, you'd have all sorts of nutrient deficiencies. And that really shouldn't be a huge surprise because those meals were as high as 64% carbohydrate. And as we've already discussed, these carbohydrate sources like bread and pasta are pretty poor sources of essential nutrients. It's also worth saying that you shouldn't eat meals created in a factory by a corporation because it's very consistent in the research that in terms of health outcomes, you want to eat food that's created by an actual person at home in their kitchen.
And I mean, what is it that makes that important? What's the difference between food made in a factory and home cooked?
Well, it's a good question, and I think we're going to talk about that as a recurring theme in this episode. But one thing would just be cheap, poor quality ingredients. So you're going to see a lot of refined seed oils, which are what I call industrial seed oils, in a lot of these foods. They're quite ubiquitous and they promote inflammation in the body. You'll see a lot of artificial flavors or flavor enhancers, that kind of thing, and all sorts of added artificial sweeteners and the kind of classic E numbers and those sorts of things. So we'll talk a bit more about that. But
so this is kind of the whole ultra processed foods thing of essentially if it's got ingredients in it that aren't things that you'd find in your typical home kitchen, that's probably a bad sign.
Exactly right. And that's probably a good principle that you've hit on right there. And I often say to my clients, if it has more than 5 ingredients, especially if some of them are just sort of very, very long technical sounding words, then it's probably something you should avoid. And it's probably worth making the distinction between something that's minimally processed, like let's say coconut milk, where obviously you have to do some degree of processing to get coconut milk from its natural coconut shell into a can.
You just milk them, don't you?
Versus an ultra processed food. I don't know. I don't want to pick on anything in particular, but you can go in the average sweet shop and you'll just be surrounded by things like that. So, things that require an entire factory production line to create, like biscuits.
Yeah.
So having talked about what you shouldn't do, what should you do? Well, I don't actually think there is a single diet that's optimal for everyone. And I think the assumption that there's one ideal diet for everyone is a big part of the problem. And I think the future is going to be all about individualized nutrition and individualized medicine. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in future episodes. But back to these nutritional guidelines, if you're going to have them, they should be based around a set of principles that promote optimum health. And they shouldn't be, a specific blueprint that outlines one diet. So my first principle is that you should base your diet around the most nutrient-dense foods. So I'm talking about meat, fish and seafood, eggs, vegetables, starchy roots and tubers, low-sugar fruit, nuts and seeds, and herbs and spices.
And starchy roots and tubers, you're meaning like root vegetables, and so potatoes, carrots, things like that?
Yeah, things like that. Butternut squash, turnips, not sprouts. What are they called? You have them at Christmas. You milk them. What are they called? Not turnips.
Parsnips.
So the next principle is that you should eat whole foods. And that means foods that are minimally processed versus those that are ultra processed that we just talked about. So that means avoiding industrially manufactured foods that contain ingredients that you wouldn't cook with at home. So these are things like emulsifiers and preservatives, artificial sweeteners and flavor enhancers, and that kind of thing. You should eat wild caught fish and meat from grass-fed animals. You should include organ meat because it's by far the most nutrient-dense class of food. You should try to eat organic vegetables because they contain higher levels of antioxidants like flavonols and anthocyanins. And studies have shown that eating organic foods can increase your antioxidant intake by as much as 40%.
I mean, that's quite significant.
Yeah, I think other studies have shown that organic vegetables can have as much as 50% more vitamin and mineral content as well. So, and also you're avoiding pesticide residues, which is another topic that we should dive into. I'll probably talk about some more. So you should prioritize freshness, because if we take the example of spinach, once you've pulled it out of the soil, after 8 days, it will have lost 50% of its folate content. And so you shouldn't do a weekly shop and then keep fruits and vegetables in the fridge for days and days, because you just don't know how long they've already been out of the ground. So you really want to be buying fresh fruits and vegetables and eating them pretty soon.
Is there anything that you can do to sort of try and combat that? Like, what's your position on freezing, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I typically will have things like frozen broccoli and frozen sprouts and various other things on hand, because once those fresh vegetables have run out after a day or two, I definitely would go for frozen vegetables, and they've been shown to have almost as many nutrients and be a really good option for sure.
Nice.
So the next principle, you should eat and cook with healthy oils. That means that you should definitely avoid what I just referred to as industrial seed oils. So these vegetable oils, they include things like sunflower oil, soybean oil, rapeseed oil, and corn oil. But you'd also have to throw in there margarine and these other vegetable-based spreads. And instead of
includes, is that also canola oil for our American listeners?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't actually know the answer to that. So maybe that can be a listener mail in the future.
I have a feeling it's the same or very similar to rapeseed.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll make a note to come back and answer that in a future episode because, yeah, it's a good point. It's something I don't know about. So instead of any of those, you should eat and cook with coconut oil, avocado oil, macadamia nut oil, beef dripping, and lard. Those are typically the things that I have to hand and that I cook with. And olive oil is also very good, but it should never be heated above 160 degrees. And you want to get extra virgin olive oil because it has the highest polyphenol content.
What about butter?
Yeah, it's a good point. I should really have included butter in the list. You want to have good quality butter from grass-fed cows, and that will be rich in vitamin K2, especially in springtime. And yeah, again, similar to olive oil, only gently heat it if you're going to cook with butter.
Okay, so the only thing that sort of strikes me when you list that is most of those things are things that I automatically would avoid because of saturated fat. It isn't sort of generally the message that lots of vegetable oil products are recommended because they're lower in saturated fat, and then that should mean they're more heart healthy.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic to get into. You'll note coconut oil on the list, and that's about 86% saturated fat, which might surprise some people, especially as it's universally seen as being healthy. How to very quickly short circuit a very long conversation about saturated fat. I mean, we are definitely going to do an episode on this and unpack it. I think the thing to say is that the evidence base for avoiding foods high in saturated fat is weak at best. And we need to do a whole episode where we explore where the evidence came from, why fat was vilified, and what the consequences were for our health.
Perfect. All right, it sounds good. But to summarize, you're saying essentially, for at least in the case of these cooking oils, it's not something that you need to necessarily worry about.
No, I don't have a concern with any of those.
Nice.
Next principle then is that you should eat nose to tail, which is important because it provides a much more complete nutrition than focusing just on muscle meat on its own. There are advantages to eating food that's in season, so that's another thing to think about. You should consider consuming bone broth because it provides collagen, gelatin, glycine, and other key minerals. You should get regular doses of sunshine to get vitamin D, although most people living as far north as we do in the UK are going to be very unlikely to meet their needs from sunshine alone. So supplementing here is important. And we've talked about why it's so important before. And you can find our recommended vitamin D supplement on the website. But I think we'll talk more about that in a minute. The next thing to mention is that if you tolerate them, you should include full-fat dairy products. And that would include good quality butter, as Ed mentioned, from grass-fed cows.
Okay, so we've talked about this probably in previous episodes a little bit, but when you say if you tolerate, how do you know if you tolerate dairy? Are we just talking about sort of lactose intolerance type stuff?
It's actually a really good question. There's a whole host of issues that can relate to the consumption of dairy products. So the ones that I see a lot of are bloating, diarrhea, skin symptoms, skin issues, mucus production, fatigue, brain fog, joint pains, autoimmune flare-ups, and hormone imbalances. And probably because one of my specialist areas is skin health, I see a lot of people with acne that's often entirely down to an immune reaction to one of the components in dairy.
Right. So it could be it's quite common, and it could be that people out there are consuming dairy without knowing that they're intolerant.
Absolutely. So you should ask yourself if you're experiencing any of those symptoms, whether you really tolerate dairy products. And a really sensible strategy is to completely eliminate them for 60 days, track your symptoms and see what happens, and then reintroduce dairy products. And again, see what happens. So obviously, a lot of people know about lactose intolerance as being one of the most well-known problems with dairy, but I see a lot of immune-mediated reactions and gut issues where the trigger is one of the proteins in milk called casein, and that can be really problematic.
Interesting.
So some of the other principles on the list would be things like avoid grains, support gut health by eating fermented foods, minimize toxins like pesticide residues. That was what I was getting at with the focusing on organic produce, and hydrate appropriately with clean water. One other thing that is definitely worth mentioning here is that you shouldn't take for granted that the best way to eat is to have 3 meals a day plus snacks, because the evidence is pretty compelling that periods of fasting are hugely beneficial. But I think we'll have to do a whole episode on fasting to explore that properly.
Oh yeah, for sure. When should we eat? Good episode title there.
Okay, we'll do when to eat. If this episode is what to eat, yeah, good shout. Also, it's really beneficial to leave proper gaps between meals so that you engage something called the migrating motor complex, which is this really important process whereby a peristaltic wave travels through the small intestine and clears out debris like partially digested food and any bacteria that's made its way into the small intestine, and it pushes it into the large intestine. And this cleanup process just doesn't happen if you do this pattern of 3 meals a day plus snacks. So if you're eating between meals, it doesn't happen. And that's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of the trend to sort of constantly eat throughout the day. And I see a lot of people who have adopted this strategy of just grazing, and I definitely have concerns about it and don't think it's optimal.
And I mean, is that something that you can feel? So the peristaltic wave, is that just your tummy rumbling when you're hungry?
This is a very good question. Yeah, typically people mistake it for exactly what you just said, because you get a gurgling for sure. And we associate it with, oh, I must be hungry, time to eat. But actually, it's just this physiological cleanup process happening. And if you have good metabolic flexibility, in other words, you're not reliant on exogenous glucose every 3 hours, you can have this migrating motor complex happen and still go several hours without food and be absolutely fine. But what actually happens is very often when people leave this strategic gap, as we would have done in our ancestral context, you suddenly start to feel better. All sorts of interesting things happen.
Okay, so it is that feeling. So I guess a test for people if they're wanting to see whether they're leaving long enough gaps is to say, well, have you felt your stomach rumbling a bit?
Yeah.
But then not necessarily using that as a trigger to say, oh, I better eat immediately.
Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice. Yes.
Interesting.
So something else that's worth mentioning that I see a lot is that we seem to have moved quite a long way from a really basic concept of basing meals around meat and 2 veg. And I think, it's a pretty sound concept. And instead of that, I see a lot of people eating main meals that are essentially kind of treat foods. And, I almost sort of can't get my head around it, but people are every day eating tropical chia pudding bowls and having nut butter smoothies. And I
have to say that's not something that I come across very often.
Yeah, maybe it's quite a niche subject, but
you're in a certain context.
I think there's.
But I agree that not like a lot of people aren't eating meat and 2 veg every day.
Yeah. Right. So maybe that's a topic for a future podcast. We'll see if we get any feedback on that.
Yeah, anyone who eats tropical chia pudding every day would like to hear from you.
Right. Let's just finish off this list then. So one thing I want to say for certain is, look, don't get me wrong. I'm all for including treats, and an optimum diet should definitely include dark chocolate. And I also think that people need to experiment and find out what works for them. So probably the final principle is to listen to your body. And I find that when my clients remove sugar and excess carbohydrate, they can be much more in tune with what their body needs, especially if they're, doing a lot of sport or training for, triathlon or something. I see a lot of people that are trying to push their body hard, and once they clean up their diet, they get very clear signals about what their body needs, and it's quite an interesting phenomenon. But I definitely think
Any examples? What sort of signals?
where your body will tell you that it needs a particular food. You might literally crave meat. You might specifically crave red meat. I often have people say, "Oh, I crave steak," or "Oh, I craved vegetables," and I find that very interesting. I haven't seen any studies on it, but it seems certainly in my clinical experience to be an interesting phenomena.
Okay, good one to watch out for.
Again, love to hear from listeners on that. I would just basically say that an ideal starting point for most people is probably a moderate carbohydrate paleo type diet where they follow the set of principles we'd outlined here, and then they just tweak it to find what works for them.
Okay, so I think there's quite a lot there, and I think we should put those principles up on the website. But I think you've created a kind of example meal plan that we can then discuss and kind of use as, I guess, a kind of articulation of these principles as a starting point.
I have, yeah, and we'll put this on the website, so we won't spend too long going over it here now because people can go and look at it for themselves. But I created a meal plan which is an optimum one-day diet, essentially, and it was just to show that although it's hard to meet all your nutrient needs, it is possible. So
right.
We've got breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and we've got 3 snacks. So for breakfast, we're having bacon, cheese, and potato omelette with sautéed mushrooms and spinach. For lunch, I wanted an office-friendly option, so I designed a steak and avocado salad. I mean office-friendly because you can't really start eating, a tin of fish in the office. That doesn't go down well. And then for dinner, we've got pan-seared salmon with butternut squash mash and asparagus and a bit of steamed kale. And then for snacks, I went with coconut chips, a bar of dark chocolate, and some raw almonds. And then it occurred to me, well, you could actually combine those things if you wanted and make quite a tasty little dark chocolate sort of cluster.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's just have a quick
look. I mean, that does all look pretty tasty, I've got to say.
Well, this is the key thing that, I don't want people to think that to be healthy, they've got to suffer. Absolutely. One of the principles is that your food should be extremely palatable and tasty and keep you going and fill you up and everything else. But the key thing here is that with the exception of vitamin D, which we've already talked about in terms of you're going to need to supplement with it, this meal plan meets all nutrient targets. So you can see here that it hits protein and fat and carbohydrate and hits every single vitamin, every single mineral.
And you did it without even including any liver or kidneys.
I did it. Yeah. Yeah. No offal. So, I think, as you say, it's pretty tasty. That seems to be relatively palatable. People might say, oh, they haven't got time to make an omelette every morning, but I think you can probably reheat stuff and make enough for 2 days, and so on. So, yeah.
But also, I guess, as you were saying, you want to be aiming to hit your nutrient targets most days, but, everyone's busy. And I guess this is a kind of perfect meal plan that you've outlined. I guess people can look at it and compare it to their current diet, and it just creates some suggestions or kind of inspiration for things that you could change just to get a bit closer to it.
Exactly. And I definitely encourage people to play around with their own optimum one-day diet plan and send them in to us. We're curious.
Yeah.
Great.
And I'm guessing you would not recommend that people just eat that every day in spite of it.
You could do worse, but no, I wouldn't suggest people eat the same thing over and over and over again. I mentioned about not doing a 1-week shop or weekly shop, so you don't want to have the food in the fridge for a long period of time. But you could also argue that you don't want to shop in the same supermarket and buy the same vegetables because they're probably grown in the same soil and they probably have the same nutrient, profile. So yeah, you definitely want to mix this up as much as possible. But now we're going right into the weeds.
That would be an interesting rabbit hole to go down.
All right, should we move on?
Yes, let's do it. I think, okay, that was a good, interesting opening topic. But so, yeah, should we move on to listener mail before we get to the case study?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so we've had a message this time that I thought would be worth going into a little bit more detail on. This one is from Catherine, who says, I was interested in the topic of iron deficiency from episode 1 and wondered if there's a deeper dive into this and maybe other mineral deficiencies coming in later episodes. I felt like the issue of women bearing most of the burden of iron deficiency was disappointingly glossed over, and I'd like to know more about it and its consequences, as well as lifestyle recommendations to improve it.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Catherine. I mean, we're definitely going to dive into it to exactly this kind of topic in future. I mean, it's really the basis for this podcast. So let's start with iron, because it's a really big problem. As I mentioned before in a previous episode, it's been estimated that somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion people worldwide are deficient in iron. And it can have a pretty significant impact on your quality of life. But the question is, why are women more likely to experience iron deficiency than men? Well, firstly, women store less iron than men. So men on average can store between 500 and 1500 milligrams of iron, whereas women can only store sort of 300 to 500 milligrams. So
wow, what's it? So like literally just that the body is capable of storing really, that's like up to maybe only a third of the amount.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And so what this means is that women are more vulnerable to depletion from monthly blood loss through menstruation or pregnancy and childbirth. So average menstrual blood loss is around 30 to 40 milliliters per cycle, but a full-term pregnancy can actually deplete a woman's iron stores by as much as 1,000 milligrams. And that's why women get maternal anemia, where they have symptoms like fatigue, dizziness, and increased susceptibility to infection. So another factor, and I see this a lot in my clinic, is that women are much more likely to avoid red meat due to concerns over saturated fat and cholesterol, and are typically consuming more plant-based iron sources, which contain non-heme iron from lentils or spinach or whatever. And these are poorly absorbed due to anti-nutrients like phytates and oxalates.
We talked about this a bit before in a previous episode. So this is the stuff where other things that you're eating or potentially in the same food are actually stopping you from absorbing the nutrient that's in the food that you're eating.
Yeah, they literally bind with those minerals and then they prevent them being taken up by the body.
Right. Okay, so if I just go back over this, we've got a kind of double whammy or a triple whammy of women's bodies naturally having just a lower capacity to store iron. So I guess that would mean that you need, in order to achieve optimal amounts, you need to be consuming it pretty regularly. And for those that are menstruating, you've got a certain amount being lost, or indeed, if you're pregnant, then a lot more being lost. And then this dietary pattern that you're pointing out of eating less red meat, which would be a source of iron, I guess.
Yeah, and I'll throw another one into the mix. And I see this because it's one of my specialist areas, but I see a lot of people, women in particular, suffering from gut issues, including today's case study, Jemima. So those might include low stomach acid, which reduces iron absorption, gut dysbiosis, SIBO, or the slang term leaky gut, all of which lead to malabsorption of iron and other minerals. I also see a lot of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which can reduce iron absorption. And because it's so critical for health, iron deficiency can cause a ton of symptoms, but right at the top of the list would be persistent fatigue, and then you'd have things like brain fog, shortness of breath, and weakened immunity. So basically, it makes everyday tasks just feel like a real struggle. It can also have an effect on thyroid function, meaning that people feel sluggish and they might feel cold all the time. They might get restless leg syndrome, they might have brittle nails, and it might take them a long time to recover from exercise. So these are all things to look out for.
I mean, it's really wide ranging, isn't it? I mean,
it really is.
It's going to affect almost everything in your life.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other really interesting things. One is that there's such a dependency on iron in the brain that a deficiency can mimic symptoms of ADHD, depression, or even neurodegenerative diseases. And it's essential for neurotransmitter production like serotonin and dopamine as well. Another really interesting aspect of this is iron's role in immune function. So because iron is so important, your body is actually really protective of it. So when you get an infection, your body will actively hide iron stores from the pathogen. So it literally lowers iron levels in your blood as a defense mechanism so that bacteria and viruses can't hijack it for their own use. And this is a kind of defense mechanism. And that's because these bacteria and viruses thrive on iron and essentially compete with you to use it to attack you. So, as you say, it's quite the topic.
Yeah.
And that's typically why I don't advise people to take an iron supplement, just because it's much safer to get it from the most highly available sources from whole foods, which means heme iron from red meat, liver, shellfish, and eggs. I think there are some exceptions. I have worked with clients where they're following a strictly plant-based diet and they really struggle to make their iron needs. And so in those cases, they've actually been to their GP and had blood tests, and then I have advised an iron supplement. But I don't like it as a long-term fix to that kind of problem. It should be a short-term intervention, I think.
Okay, wow. Yeah, so that's really useful. Good deep dive into why this affects women so particularly. For any women listeners who don't know their iron levels or might be worried about it, do you have any final parting advice?
I think if you can relate to any of the symptoms that we've talked about, you can definitely ask your general practitioner to run an iron panel and do a test. I think it's a safe thing to do, or rather a sensible thing to do. And the other thing obviously is you could track what you're eating in Chronometer, as we've discussed previously.
Perfect. Thanks. All right, should we move on to our case study then? We're going to discuss Jemima. We're
going to dig into Jemima's case. So I'm going to show this on the screen so that Ed can help me bring it to life. But what we have is a 37-year-old female who first came to see me in October 2022, with the main symptoms being that she had a stomach that was painful and upset. She suffered from flatulence and low energy and occasional headaches. She also had some mood issues like irritation and sadness, and quite a complex family history of heart attack and cancer and kidney stones. So a lot of different things in the mix. This is just a classic case of somebody living with a collection of symptoms that for them are, quote unquote, normal, and that because in other respects she's fit and healthy, she can just put up with these things over time. Right. But then once you start digging into it and you have conversations with clients, they start to realize that these things aren't normal and that you can get to the bottom of them, and then you'd no longer have to live with them if you can identify them and treat them.
Yeah, which is quite sort of exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that's the kind of bulk of what I do, if you like, in terms of my clinical practice. So when I hear somebody say they've got gastrointestinal symptoms like Jemima, I immediately suspect things like bacterial overgrowth, possible food sensitivities or intolerances, especially when somebody says, I really like bread, but I think it disagrees with me. And, you start to suspect things like maldigestion, which would contribute to nutrient deficiencies. And then you would look at their diet and you would see that there are those nutrient deficiencies. And so that would help explain things like suboptimal energy levels. And, you might see lots of deficiencies in B vitamins and magnesium and so on. And that might help explain persistent headaches. And so you quickly build up this picture.
Yeah.
And so her initial diet analysis showed that there was a clear need to improve the quality of her diet. And you can see here that she was sort of only meeting sort of 60% or so of her protein needs.
Yeah.
Even less when it comes to fats. So it's quite interesting. But
that's like only 50% of omega-6s.
Yeah. But the interesting aspect of this case was actually that the client was able to spend money on testing. So we started by running a number of tests. We ran a comprehensive stool analysis, which tells you a lot about what's going on in the gut. We ran a test to see if her immune system was reacting to certain foods. And that's a key part of helping to heal the gut, because it's hard to heal the gut if somebody's reacting to foods they're eating on a constant basis. And we also did a really detailed advanced panel looking at the components of wheat and whether or not she was reacting to the components of wheat.
So if we just have based on her own kind of intuition that bread didn't agree with her.
It started with the comprehensive stool analysis.
Right.
If we have a brief look at these now, I can share them with Ed. We can see that her stool profile, which assesses the health of the gastrointestinal tract, really it shows that she was in good shape in all areas except one where she had a significant overgrowth of unfriendly bacteria. And so...
Right, I mean, that's rating it as 10 out of 10 for problems, or very high need for support. It's
saying a very high need for support. Exactly. So we can see that they run both a PCR analysis and a culture of the stool, and you can see that we have very high levels of lactobacillus and various...
Oh wow, okay, right. So this is literally going down into specifically what bacteria have been found in the stool, and then how much of them.
Yes, but they also grow them out in a petri dish to show which species are pathogenic. Luckily for Jemima, she didn't have any species that were pathogenic, but very interesting.
So what does that mean, that they're not pathogenic?
Well, it means that they're part of her commensal flora. It's just that they haven't happened to have overgrown. But there was an interesting exception where there's a species called Ruminococcus, which was shown at very high levels. And the lab technician specifically said to me, that's unusual because it's usually found in animals, particularly dogs. And this particular client does have a dog, and I happen to know that it licks her face. And so I had an interesting conversation with my client about the behavior of the dog doing this and how it can affect the gut microbiome. And
Wow.
a lot of people don't understand that the oral microbiome has a direct bearing on the gut microbiome. So, you really want to start with really good oral health, and then you can't look at one and not the other.
Okay, so just if I play that back, just as in this example, you're saying this is not a pathogenic bacteria, so it's not like it's necessarily harmful, but the amount of it that was in her gut is likely causing some sort of imbalance and contributing to symptoms, and that was caused most likely by her dog licking her face.
That's right, yeah, and it could easily be contributing to several of her symptoms. So
that's crazy that you can identify that from this test, actually.
Yeah, well, it was amusing that the lab technician brought it up.
Yeah.
So some of the other pages show things like they rule out that she has any parasites, and it gives you guidance on which either prescriptive or natural agents to use to combat these bacterial species, because some of them are resistant to certain antibiotics.
Right.
So if we just take a look at the other two tests that we ran then, these are both blood tests. One is looking at a a panel of 200 foods, and it's looking specifically whether or not she's having an IgG immune reaction to those foods. So this is a delayed immune reaction, which you would call a sensitivity or an intolerance. And you can see here that she's reacting to quite a lot of foods, but the ones that really stand out are cow's milk and oats.
Right.
So she was eating oats every day and having a big reaction to those. And that's clinically relevant because you're going to struggle to heal somebody's gut if they're eating a food every day that's a trigger.
Good link back to both the previous episode and our discussion about milk tolerance earlier.
Absolutely, yeah. And so if we look at this third and final blood test, you can see that this was a very detailed test looking at as many of the different components in wheat as we can test for. So these are the components that it breaks down into during digestion, the protein and peptide components. And you can see here that gamma-gliadin is very high. She's having a high reaction to gamma-gliadin. And that basically fits with what she was telling me about, I don't think wheat agrees with me. And so these are the sorts of tests that you need to run in order to then be able to say, okay, well, what is the right protocol to heal this person's gut? And I'll bring that up on the screen so you can see it. So we did an 8-week protocol, which involved a supplement that disrupts biofilm. And that's because these bacteria live in colonies where they surround themselves by biofilm, which is a bit like, I guess, like tadpoles or rather frog spawn in a pond. You can think of it a bit like that. And it can mean that they can evade the body's own defenses. And so you need to disrupt that biofilm so that you can actually target the bacteria. And then you can see here that we're rotating through a combination of a supplement called berberine and then an extract from oregano, both of which are quite potent, broad spectrum sort of antimicrobials. And you rotate through them because the bacteria might start to become resistant or mount some kind of defense against them. So you would do berberine for 2 weeks and then switch to oregano and then rotate through them again. And then,
is that then going to disrupt all the good bacteria as well?
Well, nothing like as much as going down the pharmaceutical route. So that is an option for clients. They can say, I want to take amoxicillin or some other pharmaceutical, but this is just a much gentler way of doing it where there'll be less fallout. But then you do this weeding phase, and then you need to do a seeding phase. So you can see here that at week 9, we introduce a custom probiotic. And that's another interesting aspect of this case. So we did another stool test a few months later.
So this is a stool test after she'd been going through the protocol.
Exactly right, yeah. And then so she's been doing the protocol for a little while. We do an additional stool test, and then based on the progress that she's made, because she's made quite a lot of progress, it's looking a lot better. You can see here microbiome diversity and so on. And then they formulate a custom probiotic. And you can see here, this is literally the supplement label, where it has lactobacillus acidophilus and various other specifically chosen bacteria in the right quantities to shift her gut microbiome to a favorable place. And so you can continue the healing process through something like this. And I've seen quite good results for some clients with it. And
amazing.
If we come back and we look at where she got to, so she did really, really well. It took about 5 months and quite a lot of hard work, quite a lot of testing. But Jemima achieved her goals, so she no longer had gastrointestinal distress. And as long as she didn't stray into foods that caused problems, and a big one of those for her was wheat, which was identified on that test, she had stable energy, felt much happier overall, had sort of better moods and good quality of life. And the key one for her, though, really was just, this gastrointestinal problems that she'd lived with for a long time.
Yeah, I guess it shouldn't really be that surprising, but I mean, there's a kind of clear and direct link that you're saying you've uncovered a whole load of food sensitivities and gut health problems it's not at all surprising that she would then experience gastrointestinal distress as a result of that. But that then has a kind of knock-on effect onto her mood and just sort of general quality of life is just, I don't know, I think it's worth highlighting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how people don't make that connection where they might have an unhappy gut and have an unhappy mood. And, it's sort of well established in the literature that that's a common link. And I guess my closing thoughts on this case are that, these are the sorts of symptoms I see all the time. And for me, they all come under the heading of evolutionary mismatch, meaning that Jemima was eating a diet that she just simply wasn't adapted to. And that was compounded by modern lifestyle factors like chronic stress and a sedentary office job. And what I find is that when you put people on a species appropriate diet, as I would call it, and you address these underlying gut pathologies, their symptoms resolve and they can go about their everyday life. But along the way, and this is the crucial thing, they've discovered what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And a big part of that is education. So I spend a lot of time with my clients, and we spend a lot of time talking about how to navigate today's complex food environment. And so hopefully today's episode helps our listeners do that.
Yeah, I love it. That's fantastic. Well, I think that kind of brings us pretty much to the end of the episode. I guess my key reflections from this discussion are that you should think twice before letting your dog lick your face in case it leads to depression. maybe a sort of somewhat tenuous link, but I guess it's literally possible. I think also it was really interesting looking at your kind of sample food diary of things that would meet your nutritional needs, and thinking, actually, I would be quite happy to eat that every day, or things like that every day.
Yeah.
And any final thoughts from you?
Well, probably just one final thought is that a lot of what people consider normal, it just isn't normal human physiology, and from an evolutionary perspective, definitely isn't normal. And the list of symptoms that I mentioned before, like chronic fatigue and brain fog and bloating and all these things, they're very, very common. But just because they're common doesn't mean that they're normal. And I want everyone to realize that these things aren't normal, and that in my experience, if you take the time to tackle them at a root cause, they can be resolved.
Yeah, I guess that sort of so clearly came through in the discussion about iron as well, in particular.
Yeah.
That there might be so many women, or we know there are so many women out there with iron deficiencies that might be suffering from these symptoms and just be putting up with it, which they don't need to. Yeah. Or hopefully they don't need to.
Yeah, so it'd be very interesting to hear what people have to say about today's episode.
All right, amazing. Well, thanks everyone very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. And if you'd like to hear more, be sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss out on our next episode. And if you've got any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, you can find our contact details on the website. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
Yeah, and it's goodbye from me. Thank you, Ed. And bye, everyone. Episode 3, Edward. Episode 3.
This is where we really kind of hit our stride and get into the kind of golden age of the podcast.
Absolutely.